So now, once we are done with our due diligence, we have discovered risks and we've tried to allocate and mitigate these risks. It is now time to move ahead in the transaction and begin drafting our definitive documents. Now, what are definitive documents? These are agreements that you will draft, negotiate upon, and have executed as part of the transaction. Different transactions will have different kinds of definitive documents. So for example, in a share issuance, you would have a share subscription agreement or an investment agreement. In the case of a share transfer, you'd have a share purchase agreement. Along with these agreements, parties may also want to enter into a separate shareholders agreement which will govern the rights and obligations of the parties to the contract, namely the promoter, the investor, and the company. Now, it is absolutely vital that the company is being made as a party to these agreements as well. The reason being that in a private company, the issuance of the shares or a transfer of the shares is also dependent upon a board resolution which will have to be passed by the company. It is also essential for the company to be a party in the shareholders agreement because the shareholders agreement needs to be converted into the articles of association, again something that the company will be able to do or should be able to do with a special resolution as well as a board resolution. As a result, parties to the agreement must include the company as well, even if it is an agreement that defines the rights and obligations of shareholders only. Now let's take a look at what is the timeline in terms of which agreements come in when. Let's take a look at a share subscription agreement. Now, share subscription agreement is an agreement between the company, the promoters, and the investor for the investor to transfer money to the company and the company to issue fresh shares to the investor. Effectively, a share subscription agreement is nothing but a contract of an agreement to sell. Consider comparing this with an agreement to sell under Section 54 of the Transfer of Property Act, where the agreement to sell is not the conveyance deed itself, but an agreement to enter into a conveyance deed at some point of time in the future. Once a share subscription agreement has been executed, we then move towards closing out of any conditions precedent or satisfaction of conditions precedent. Once all conditions precedent have been satisfied, we can then move towards closing out the agreement or closing out the transaction by the transfer of money from the investor to the company and the issuance of shares from the company to the investor. At this point of time, the investor is now a shareholder, and this is when the shareholders agreement kicks in. So, in terms of a share subscription transaction, the share subscription agreement closes when you have the shares being transferred to the investor. The moment the shares have been transferred to the investor, the shareholders agreement begins to take force. This was a brief introduction on definitive documentation. We're going to be talking more about what elements of or what kinds of terms and conditions we'll be using in various documentation before we actually move on to the actual terms and conditions.